A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to the third session of today, which is on the re-emerging of the security in the High North. My name is Tero Vauraste. I am Senior Business Development Advisor with the Finnish satellite company ICEYE, and thank you for all of those visiting ICEYE. Hopefully you had a nice afternoon over there. And I'm a Global Fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're going to have a great lineup of panelists today, and I'll start by inviting them to the podium with a couple of remarks. So Ms. Ruth Harris is the Director of Defence, Security and Infrastructure Group at RAND Europe. She's been serving for UK Armed Forces and been employed for many years for humanitarian assistance with an experience from the United Nations, ICRC, NATO and armed forces from across Europe and the US. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Petteri Taalas is the Director General, Secretary General of the World's Meteorological Organization. Petteri, a good friend of mine from 20 years back. We've had Arctic endeavors within the ice-breaking industry. And Petteri has been serving as the Director General of the Finnish Meteorological Institute. He's a professor and a scientist. He holds a PhD in meteorology and been a member of the United Nations SG Gutierrez Climate Core Group and also serving as Chairman of the Board of the University of Eastern Finland. Petteri, welcome to the podium. And finally, my dear colleague from the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ms. Marisol Maddox, who is a Senior Arctic Analyst at the Polar Institute of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., who considers the nexus of Arctic research, climate change, security and geopolitics. Welcome, Marisol. So our scope for the discussion today is to have a look into the Ukraine situation, how that spills into the Arctic, and what are the geopolitical dimensions for that in the northern sphere. And for the lineup today, we're going to have an environmental view, a climate view, then a view on the different types of military organizations, which we already spoke to some extent in the morning, and also then a societal perspective. So we'll have introductory remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll go for a lively discussion, and I'll be inviting you, dear audience, to enter into the discussion at an early stage. So please come up and prepare your questions as we go. But science is key for everything, so let us give the floor first to our science floor, and Petteri is kindly giving us an insight of the climate change, especially how that reflects the Arctic, and then we'll continue for the security approaches for that. So, Petteri, what are your thoughts on the new floods and precipitations which are going where nobody knows, and we have hurricanes, which is, by the way, good business for ICEYE, but that's another story. We see sea level rise, we see glaciers melt down. So what's happening?
Okay, thanks for the invitation, and I'm happy that many of you decided still to come because it's Saturday afternoon, and I'm sure that you have some other interests. But thanks for joining this event. And I will tell you what we know about climate change with the flavor to Arctic, and I'm sure that my colleagues here will tell more about the security policy, which is not my everyday topic in Geneva. So I'm leading World Meteorological Organization, which is the UN specialized agency on weather, climate and water. And we are a fairly old organization, and we are very much working together with national experts from academia, meteorological, hydrological services, and growingly also private sector like players like ICEYE, which I was just had a pleasure to visit. And then we are also hosting IPCC, which is providing scientific reports on the status of climate, and we have just got 3 major reports out during the past months. And inside UN we have a core group of of climate expertise, and I'm one of the 4 members of that, and we are very much advising Secretary General Guterres. And we are running the global observing system, real-time observing system based on ground-based satellite, balloon, aircraft, vessel measurements, and despite of this war in Ukraine, this basic data is on daily basis exchanged, including the Russian data. We have lost some data from Ukraine, but the basic data which is needed for weather forecasting, we are still exchanging it freely. This is the view of World Economic Forum, which had its meeting in June. Which are the biggest risks for the global economy during the coming 10 years? And from their perspective, climate action failure is number 1. Extreme weather events that we are seeing also today, they are number 2. And in the bottom, they can see this kind of crisis that is going on in Ukraine. And of course, we all hope that this war in Ukraine wouldn't harm the global economy during the coming 10 years. We will see what happens. Then a few facts about climate change. So we have this warming has continued, and last 5 years have been the warmest era in record since 1850. And in the Arctic, you can see lots of red color, which means that Arctic has warmed the most globally. And there's an anomaly south of Greenland and Iceland, which is related to slowing down of Gulf Stream because of melting of fresh water from Greenland glacier. So that's taking place, and that has had local impact, but globally you can see that Arctic has warmed much more than the global average. And especially it has happened during the winter half of the year, and in globally it's about more than double the global warming, but in winter time it's something like 3 times the global average. And we have broken records in main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide year by year. And despite of these COVID lockdowns, where the emissions were dropping about 5%, the concentrations continue to grow because the very long lifetime of carbon dioxide. And the main problem is related to use of fossil fuels. About 85% of the carbon problem is related to consumption of fossil fuels, and about 15% is coming from land use. And there the main problem is related to deforestation in especially tropical areas, Amazon, Africa, and Southern Asia. And this is demonstrating this forest change, and you can see that especially in Latin America and Asia, this deforestation is still taking place, and sometimes, especially here in the north, there's a feeling that it's our problem, but it's very much something different. But what is happening now in the Arctic, we have started seeing growing amount of forest fires, and these hot summers, especially in Russian Arctic and also in the Canadian Arctic, they have led to record-breaking forest fires and also record-breaking emissions of carbon dioxide from those forests. And that has especially been a problem in Russia, but also partly in Canada, and a few years ago also there were big emissions coming from Sweden. We have stored more than 90% of the excess heat to ocean, and that has also contributed to sea level rise, and it has also given more energy for tropical storms. And we have started seeing growing amount of category 4 and 5 hurricanes, and there's just one hitting Florida during these days. And the sea level rise has been speeding up. It used to be 2 millimeters per year 20 years ago, and recently it has been 4.5 millimeters per year. And the growing component is coming from the melting of Greenland and Antarctic glacier. And since oceans serve as a sink of carbon dioxide, we have changed the chemical composition of the seawater. It's getting more acid. And the biggest changes have taken place in the Arctic, and there we have changed the coverage of ice, but we have especially changed the thickness of the ice, and so-called multi-year ice has practically disappeared. Still in the 80s we had a large amount of 4, 3 and 2-year-old ice, but nowadays mostly fairly thin 1-year-old ice. And both Antarctic and Greenland glaciers are melting, and so far it's about a little bit less than 1 millimeter per year of the sea level rise is coming from Greenland, and about 0.5 millimeter is coming from Antarctica, and these are the long-term drivers of sea level rise. And unfortunately, this sea level rise game we have already lost, so that will continue for the coming hundreds of years, even thousands of years, at the pace of about 0.5 meter per century. But the Antarctic risk is a major, maybe much higher. And we have seen also sea ice loss, especially in the Eurasian sector. And in 2040s, we expect that the summer and early autumn parts of the year would be ice-free, which would allow us to navigate through this Arctic area without icebreaker assistance. But one should keep in mind that especially these Russian coastal sea areas are very shallow. You cannot use the biggest ships, and of course, this geopolitical situation may be causing major challenges also from that perspective. But it's not going to be ice-free year-round, so there will be harsh winter also in the future. And we have seen also loss in spring snow cover in the Arctic, and this is also speeding up the warming in the Arctic area. And in our science, we say that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So once we have been warming Arctic so much, it has had an impact on the weather patterns in the whole northern hemisphere. We have started seeing more often these kind of stagnant weather conditions, heat wave and drought, what has happened in Europe, in China this year. And sometimes we have these rainfall areas, low pressure systems taking the same path. And we have seen that happening in Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country is flooded. So it has had an impact on weather patterns in the whole northern hemisphere. And the future, if we reach 2 degrees globally, that would mean something like 4 to 5 degrees in the Arctic, and something like 7 to 8 degrees during the Arctic winter. So in the Arctic, we will anyhow see much bigger warming than the global average. And if you look at the rainfall scenarios for the coming decades, by the end of this century, anyhow, we expect to see more rainfall taking place in the Arctic, and the snow-covered season is going to be shorter, but it's going to rain more, so we will have more snow, and in the southern parts of Arctic, like here in Helsinki, we will see more rainfall in the future. Whereas globally, we will see areas where we will have less rainfall and major problems with agriculture, for example. And this is an estimation of what might happen if we would reach 3 degrees warming, what would happen to the global farming yield. And all these red colors indicate decline, and green colors indicate increase. And you can see that these high northern latitudes are with green colors, so the agricultural conditions and forest growth is going to gain, but globally we would lose food production capacity. And that's one of the major concerns related to climate change. Good news is that we have seen already action against climate change. 32 countries have reduced their emissions during the past 15 years. All these blue colors here indicate the decrease of emissions. It's very much European countries and also USA, Japan, Singapore, and at the same time those countries have seen economic growth. So there's not an automatic connection between emission growth and GDP growth. And now we are heading towards 2.5 to 3 degrees warming, and no more towards 3 to 5, which was the message at the IPCC report in 2014. So things have moved in the right direction, but we are not yet heading towards Paris 1.5 to 2 degrees targets. But 2 degrees may still be feasible. It depends how we proceed. And finally, a couple of words about Ukraine. About 20% of the weather stations that we are having in Ukraine are no more reporting, and that's very much because of the damage caused by Russian army there, and of course there will be also challenge to recover the service skills of the Ukraine after this war is hopefully one day over. And Russians also, they are in charge of some stations in the Arctic. For example, there's one station in Tiksi, which was established by USA, Finland, and Russia together. That has stopped reporting, and actually USA was dropping out of this activity after the Crimea case. And also there's this Baranova station, which is a Russian-Finnish station, and that also has stopped reporting. And finally, a few words about this security policy perspective, more from global perspective rather than from the Arctic perspective. Agriculture is one of the areas globally which will suffer, and there are many regions globally where we expect to see lower yield because of warming and drought. And the world economy is going to suffer, and it has been shown that it's up to 20-fold cheaper to mitigate than to live with the consequences of climate change. And of course, these oil and gas dependent economies, we all know what's the situation in Russia nowadays. That's going to be a challenge. And Africa as a continent is going to be a major challenge, especially if we will see 4 billion inhabitants there by the end of this century. There would be local crises, and also it would have impact on this refugee challenge, which has already affected Europe and also politically, and also the southern part of Europe is very vulnerable. We will see higher temperatures, poorer conditions for agriculture, and also less attractive conditions for the tourists. Thanks for listening to me, and I think that we will go on with my colleagues.
Yes, thank you very much, Petteri. Very great remarks and interesting use over there. When we come back to this situation today with Russia, I mean, Russia is half of the Arctic, and could you explore what's happening in the scientific community? So, are we now missing the information from the Russian Arctic, and how is the collaboration continuing, or is it continuing? Do you still collaborate with, for instance, the Arctic and the Antarctic Institute of Russia and some others, or what's happening on that?
Yeah, that has been a major problem, question to WMO, which is promoting free access to data and free exchange of real-time data. And this core data that we are measuring, ground-based information, satellite information, balloon sounding information, that's still freely exchanged between Russia and the rest of the world. And if we would lose the Russian data, it would be a major disaster for weather forecasting, because it's covering almost 1/3 of the northern hemisphere. So that's something which is not happening. But what has happened is that all other cooperation between Western countries and Russia has been ceased. The European Meteorological Satellite Organization, EUMETSAT, European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, they are no more exchanging data with Russia, and also most European countries have stopped all scientific and technical cooperation with Russia. And we are a little bit back to this kind of Soviet era from that perspective. And it seems that some of the scientists are also leaving the country. That actually happened when Soviet Union broke down. They lost their capacity to run high-level science. For example, their space programs and satellite programs haven't been successful since the era of Soviet Union.
You were very precise on the expectation of the ice development. So what do you think of this approach, which we have heard from some of the colleagues in Russia, saying that we are heading for the ice age? There is no global warming or climate change, and nothing's happening in the Arctic. It's like freezing, not heating up. What do you think?
So I think that even Putin has given up this idea. So he has been. There was one meeting in St. Petersburg 3 years ago where Putin was present, and also the presidents and prime ministers from other Scandinavian Nordic countries. And there Putin was claiming that the Arctic has warmed 4 times the global average, and the others were saying 2 times. And I had challenge to be diplomat and say that perhaps both of them are somehow right. But even at that level, it's understood that we have climate change. And this heat wave, which was hitting Russia in 2010, was an eye-opener in Russia, where we got 50,000 casualties because of high temperatures and forest and peat fires. So nowadays it's not so big issue in Russia anymore. But of course, this dependence on fossil business, the tone is somewhat different for non-scientific reasons.
And surprisingly, we got this information after they had made the decision of investing into new icebreakers. So first they had to say that yes, there will be ice, then they got their new icebreaker program, and then they were able to say that, okay, maybe it's heating up. But a bridging question then, and then we'll go over to Marisol. So obviously you have been working also a lot with the Arctic Council, as they have many working groups which relate their work into the Arctic environmental development. So what are your thoughts on the current situation when Russia is more or less like not in the Arctic Council at all?
Yeah, of course, they are supposed to have this chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and still 5 years ago we thought that Arctic Council would be out of these political tensions that we are otherwise having between countries, and perhaps the previous U.S. administration was the one who was taking the first step to politicize this Arctic cooperation, and of course now it's totally ceased. But the Russians would still like to keep our field of cooperation alive, but the appetite in the other Arctic countries doesn't exist at the moment.
In April this year, there was expected to be the Arctic Territory of Dialogue discussion in Russia, which obviously doesn't exist.
So they proposed us that we would organize something actually in August this year on meteorology, but I say that it may not be the most great idea at the moment.
Indeed, yeah. So Marisol, you have been researching international developments in the Arctic, and also the discussion about the Arctic Council and the Arctic collaboration. So what are your thoughts on this new situation, whereas Russia is out of the Arctic Council, they're an aggressor, and in the past there's been a good collaboration. Where are we heading? So please let us hear your remarks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. So I thought I'd actually just give some kind of complimentary remarks to what we just heard, and then kind of, because I work at the intersection of climate change and security and geopolitics, that it is also, I think, really important for the security community to be understanding just how different the climate threat problem set is from the traditional way that you perceive threats, and then why it is so important that we have productive Arctic science cooperation, because of how profoundly meaningful these changes are that we're seeing for the rest of the world. So I'll just briefly, touch on each of those. So basically, we just heard a really good overview of the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. Some of these issues are incredibly important for things like the blue bioeconomy, right? And like the ability for nations that depend upon productive oceans to be able to have dependable economic revenue from that. And there are some really interesting opportunities that are coming about from climate change, so like new opportunities with just different really interesting stuff around like kelp, and because like fish are migrating, there's all these different industries that are kind of emerging. But in order to realize the benefits of some of the changes that we're seeing, we need to be really aggressive with reducing emissions so that we don't have out of control warming. Because yes, we're seeing ocean acidification, and colder water tends to acidify faster than warmer waters. We have fish that are migrating, like I said, towards the poles, but they're hitting up against that, the ocean acidification. We have harmful algae blooms that are emerging in higher latitudes than ever before, new predator-prey dynamics. just the warming of the water is also leading to a loss of dissolved oxygen in the water. So fish are having to move, not just because it's not comfortable, because there's literally not enough oxygen in the ocean, because the ocean has been absorbing our emissions, and it's basically hitting up against the ability for the ocean to continue to do that. And so, especially for the Arctic region, you really see this intersection of, the way that you think about security needs to be, yes, like we're dealing with all the kind of more conventional threats that we're seeing with Russia. And as this conference said on the first day, major war has returned to Europe. But we're also simultaneously dealing with unprecedented levels of threat to human and environmental security. And so this is really where in order to appreciate how meaningful these changes are and the magnitude of the complexity that we're dealing with, it really requires a transdisciplinary approach, because this is something that is about understanding highly complex, dynamic, interactive global systems, and really not, it's the complete opposite of siloed thinking, right? And so, in that way, I think that there's some really interesting opportunities that emerge that demonstrate the need to be more inclusive in the way that we just understand the issues that we're dealing with. And so there's some really interesting opportunities, for instance, with engaging indigenous peoples in the Arctic who, there's about an eighth of the Arctic's population is indigenous peoples. They bring tremendous knowledge, thousands of years of living in these places and through immense, times of flux and change. And so there's some really interesting ways to be engaging those communities, but it needs to be done in a way that's very cognizant of the extremely traumatic history with these groups, and that's very respectful and not extractive, right? And so that's really what co-development is about. It's not about taking their knowledge and then integrating it into Western science. It's about respectful relationship. And that actually leads me to, the necessity for understanding the nature of what it means to address this escalating threat from climate change. So, like we just heard, the climate, things are changing 4 times faster in the Arctic. This is not there. So the language that you hear around climate security, it's often we need to, fight climate change, or you talk about it as a threat, and it is a threat, but the reason that it's happening is not that Mother Nature's is mad at us, right? This is a natural response to humans emitting a lot of emissions, and anytime you have a massive change into a complex system, you're going to see the system change. And so climate change is just the very natural response of the Earth system in response to this massive infusion of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so ultimately, if you want to be effective in addressing the climate issue, this is actually about relationships, because it has to do with our relationship with the world, and really this dysfunctional core belief at the basis that humans are somehow separate from nature. We do not understand that, why I would say, common thinking does not represent the understanding that we are inherently interconnected. So human and environmental health are one and the same. You can only, if your environment is sick, it's not going to be long before humans are sick. And to understand that represents a profoundly different relationship with interacting with the world. And so this is something where we can be learning from indigenous peoples who, by definition, being able to live in one place for thousands of years and not over-extract, it's about being in relationship to the world. And so this is why it's a really hard issue for the traditional security community, which sees the way that climate change does impact their mission set. It does impact readiness. It does impact, strategic thinking. But if we actually want to address it, this is going to take an all of society type of effort, and it needs to be very inclusive. So I think that there's some interesting ideas with kind of what this looks like, but I think that we would really need to flush this out more, and having working groups. And I would be curious, if NATO, for instance, with their new Climate Center for Excellence, if there's some interest in having space for being able to talk about the different dimensions at which we need to be addressing this issue. And one interesting idea is this idea of bringing back conscription, like in the US, for instance, but expanding the ways in which it means to serve. So it wouldn't just necessarily be hard military, but also, other ways of building resilience. So, one of the other issues that we're really seeing be extremely consequential in the Arctic has to do with permafrost thaw. And again, this is something that it just has tremendous potential to be destabilizing critical infrastructure. There's real challenges with being able to detect certain incidents, especially with Russia, concerns about that fragmented relationship and the ability to detect something that has transboundary pollution potential, and being able to respond to that in a timely way, particularly with the lack of transparency. So these are all things that lead to larger need for the ability to monitor the environment. And I think that there's some interesting potential uses for satellites to be tasked more with being able to understand the changes that we're seeing. With the Arctic Council in particular, so the most recent statement from the Arctic 7 was about this limited resumption of working group activity that does not include Russia. And so I think it's important to be very clear that the activities that they're doing were all approved by Russia. So this is not in any way the A7, going rogue or having this alternate Arctic Council, because everything was approved by all 8 states. This is just the necessary response to these extraordinary circumstances. But there was a lot of pressure on the 7 Arctic states to be resuming some of the Arctic Council working group activity, because the people of the Arctic are seeing these changes firsthand. So, just greater coastal community impacts. Obviously, Alaska was just really heavily impacted in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of food security. We have warming waters that are leading to these storms that are not only not dying once they reach the Arctic, but they're being reinvigorated and actually having greater impact on these coastal communities, because there's the loss of the land-fast ice that has traditionally served as a buffer for these communities. So you're also having land subsidence, and with the permafrost thaw, it's all these components that kind of come together. And then with a lot of these communities in the coastal areas in Alaska, there are a lot of indigenous peoples, and so their food security is heavily impacted. And with the typhoon remnants that came up and had this really profound effect, there's a very limited time in which they can try to recoup their losses to be able to have food stores for the winter. And so this is where Arctic community collaboration in working groups that are looking to build that local resilience and looking to build relationships between the communities is really important to be advancing for that dimension of, these are the people who are most at risk. And so U.S. State Department's guidance for, this limited resumption of activity was basically that we're not going to have any government-to-government cooperation with Russia, but universities and different research entities are able to use their best judgment if they have some project and there is some way that they want to be engaging colleagues in Russia, that they're permitted to do so. So the U.S. government has been, kind of allowing for some of this activity that really needs to be continuing to occur, just kind of, low, on the down low, so that it's not in any way validating Russia or giving them any type of political platform, which is what absolutely cannot happen. And so there's also over a dozen federal agencies in the United States that have Arctic equities. So we have a lot of interest growing from around the world with funding different types of research projects. And there's, some of it kind of became a little bit ad hoc after the initial Arctic Council pause, with certain entities that were continuing certain types of work. So one example of an initiative that's really great related to permafrost in the United States is this Permafrost Pathways project. And actually the lead, the PI for that project just testified before US Congress on just the importance of understanding permafrost thaw from many dimensions, but also in terms of the major gaps that we have in our carbon accounting. We think that we have to reduce emissions by a certain amount by this date in order to reach our Paris targets, but we're not accounting for these abrupt thaw events in the Arctic, both land and subsea permafrost that are creating massive amounts of methane, releasing that into the atmosphere. And these are like, basically our numbers are way off. And for the global policy community to be working on the plans for mitigation, we need to be as accurate as possible. And so that's also something that the United States government is interested in allocating some resources towards, is better ability to be monitoring Arctic carbon and modeling to understand different scenarios. So I guess I would just wrap this up by saying that, time is really not on our side with these things. This is the most profound challenge that we will deal with in our lifetimes. And we need to be as aggressive as possible in a way that also does not create a lot of externalities and that uses the precautionary principle, because there's a lot of concerns about unintended consequences and maladaptation efforts and how those could go wrong. And that's also where I think learning from Indigenous peoples could be something that really helps to inform the larger approach towards climate change in a way that really addresses root causes as best as possible.
Thank you. You spoke a lot about inclusion in your remark, actually in many elements, and also the importance of Indigenous peoples' approach and rights. So could you elaborate your view of, especially in the current situation, of the Russian indigenous peoples and their organization RIPON, which unfortunately has become like an arm's length Kremlin fist, but what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's really challenging because RIPON had issued that really awful pro-war statement shortly after the war began, and it's things like that that make it even harder to resume normal relations if, say, Putin died tomorrow and somebody in Russia wanted to go a different direction. There's still, just because of how disgusting the war has been, and seeing kids from Ukraine that are being relocated to the Arctic, to Murmansk, for instance, the level of depravity that we've seen has just been awful. So things like that have a very corrosive impact on Arctic cooperation and make it harder to resume those relationships. And it's like the same thing that we saw with NARFU and the rector who issued this just over-the-top pro-war statement that NARFU was an important player in the Arctic Council working groups, and that will have an impact on the relationship, unfortunately.
What's your takeaway and thoughts on the Arctic Economic Council, which is not a part of the Arctic Council, but an independent organization? They continue their collaboration with Russian businesses, the ones which are not on the sanction list, by the way. The ones that are on the sanction list have been closed from the collaboration. But actually, only 2-3 years ago, before things started developing drastically the way they are developing, there was a lot of new Russian companies entering into the Arctic Economic Council. So what do you think of that? What do you think of the fact that the Arctic Economic Council is still continuing collaboration with the Russian entities that are not sanctioned?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I know like some companies had chosen to leave because they said that they're also just pausing their cooperation with AEC while this is happening because they don't want to be working with Russian entities. Something that has been really under the radar with this is that the companies that have remained in the Arctic Economic Council have been required by the Russian government to download a platform to be engaging. And so it brings up a whole array of cybersecurity issues, actually, because one of these companies, for instance, is in charge of doing subsea fiber along the Aleutian Island chain for Alaska, which is an extremely sensitive area. So knowing that they've had to download a Russian state software platform is not super encouraging to hear.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so let's get back to the European side again, and the thinking about the military collaboration in terms of the current developments. So, Ruth, you've been serving in the UK Defence for a substantial amount of time, and one of the bodies that exist at the moment is JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is led by the UK, including the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, and the Baltic countries. And its role has been like picking up within the past couple of months. And it was also stressed when your former Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave his remarks on the very first weeks of what happened in Ukraine, and when things were really unclear. So what are your thoughts on JEF and perhaps Nordefco in addressing these challenges, please?
Thank you. Yes, I'll just start by apologizing. I've got some notes which I'm going to look at. I don't want to get off track, which I'm prone to do, because I'm very conscious that we are sitting between you and dinner, which I think is probably the worst slot of the day. So excuse me if I look down a little. So as we've already heard from our previous two speakers, the Arctic is a beautiful but very obviously fragile place. And when the East meets West militarization of the Cold War era ended and a spirit of real accord began to exist more between science, and the language of science really brought down some barriers. And it's worth, as we just heard about the importance of relationships, that a lot of this work was based on old and previous relationships and individual relationships that were built up and really helped overcome some previous barriers. In 2021, the sort of pandemic-induced 2-year pause of scientific research, which kind of had ebbed off, as with most things, right, was lifted, and this really precious work started again. But only a few months later, that was all over, and now there really feels like there's sort of no way through a permafrost, which actually this one doesn't feel like it's thawing right now. It's worth mentioning, I think, the courage of the thousands of Russian researchers and scientists who signed a petition against the war. I cannot imagine that played well in Moscow, and it's worth reflecting on their courage. We've heard already about the Arctic 7, but significantly, the West has lost access to important Russian research facilities located within the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. The drifting ice flow based research station, which was constructed mainly by Russian Arctic workers, will now drift in the ocean with only Russian researchers and operators on board. And this is something that we should reflect from a military point of view, in terms of the importance of presence in territorial claims, and then added to the fact that we've already mentioned that over half the territory in the Arctic is Russian, and as is half its population. The current situation is seen by some climate scientists indeed as worse than during the Cold War. The war in Ukraine is making matters more stark and more desperate. While Russia is especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, the disruption of climate-related research is ultimately detrimental to all nations. So we're left with a catch-22. So for the sake of the Earth and all its inhabitants, we need Russia involved and now. But for the sake of the inhabitants of the Earth, we must freeze Russia out, at least for now. But as Russia's freedom of action becomes more limited with markets closing down, she becomes more desperate and more reliant on China. This is a dangerous game to play, of course. As we've heard already a little, there's no guarantee that China will support Russia's export of fossil fuels on which it relies, at least not in the scale that it needs. The requirement to expand the infrastructure along the Northern Sea route is ultimately mind-blowing. Now we have to imagine a weakened Russia looking pleadingly to China, who as a near-Arctic state, as we've already discussed, is looking to bolster its own influence through Russia. And as I think as one of the previous speakers mentioned, James, China appears to be possibly the only gainer in all this right now. So I've painted a bleak picture, and perhaps deliberately to pose the question, is there indeed a military role to look for a solution? So the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, as we've already heard, involving a number of nations, is intended to provide a flexible and voluntary framework through which like-minded nations can deploy joint forces to take kind of collaborative action to deter and indeed de-escalate regional crisis quickly. It offers, if you like, a first-mover advantage and enabling a military response before a political consensus is achieved among 30 NATO allies, to trigger perhaps Article 5. Similarly, but slightly differently, right, the Nordic Defence Cooperation, NORDEFCO, the purpose is to strengthen, participate, nations' national defence, and then that's kind of a change of focus, explore common synergies and facilitate effective common solutions. It is important to notice that for this group, emphasis is very much on effective and affordable operational capability, increasing operational effect and interoperability, and quality of armed services, including sort of armaments cooperation, in which there's a large focus. So the GEF and NORDEFCO, although slightly different purposes, they offer really three interesting advantages over larger defence organisations, let's say. First is their membership. They currently include members outside NATO and EU defence structures. I'll come back to that. Meaning they would support the aspirations, or they could support the aspirations of both institutions as, for desperately want of a better word, but as coalitions of the willing. NORDEFCO's membership is more fixed, but there's definitely, when there's military value, they work for others too. The United States, for example. GEF has this kind of flexible opt-in model, and at the heart of its policy direction, it states that it's designed with flexibility at heart. It sounds like some strapline from an ad, but I think it's probably true, but it's also, I would say, designed with pragmatism at its heart. Second then, there's no requirement for consensus between all nations. This speaks to the GEF's responsiveness particularly, but it also speaks to the ability to act in the grey space of hybrid threats. At a war game we recently ran down the road from here at the Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, it was interesting that the GEF was the first place that all the players turned to for action. And these were players from across the world. NORDEFCO's arrangements similarly allow for bilateral activity among nations. But the speed of response from GEF nations to the support in the Ukraine is noteworthy. But even more significantly for this discussion and for the Arctic in general is a series of integrated activities between these nations and the extremely well-supported Cold Response 22. We talked about some other exercises and brushed over this earlier, but I think it's worth reflecting on Cold Response. It's the largest exercise since the Cold War. It's only quietly been spoken about, but around 40,000 military personnel from 27 nations. It's not NATO-led, but organized by Norwegians and involving NATO and non-NATO nations. More importantly than the exercise itself in some ways, and often common with these large exercises, is the build-up and training for the exercise before it began. The training phase began in the autumn of 21. And in many ways, this is more important, for understanding interoperability, for concepts and doctrine, for building relationships, and then followed by the 2 weeks exercise. So Cold Response's emphasis was on cold weather ops, on land, sea and air, intensive maritime activity, and really the effort between Norway and the UK was immense. And ensuring freedom of manoeuvre, deterrence, this was a significant aspect. Militarily, it was really highly successful, and I know we talked earlier about exercises that have been less so, but this really did reveal a real step change in interoperability, willingness, and effectiveness. So I'm painting now maybe a slightly favourable picture, but the phrase that the GEF can act while NATO is thinking is something that we should perhaps be wary of. I think it's always useful to do a little thinking in a time of war. But once the thinking is done, something must follow. Leaving a military vacuum is not an option, as Russia likes to fill these. The language coming from the GEF formation in March 22 off the back of Cold Response was certainly a strong warning to Russia, not only to Putin, but also, interestingly, to Belarus. Thirdly, then, and most relevant perhaps to this panel, GEF and NORDEFCO, through their membership, are uniquely focused on Northern Europe. The GEF, in its policy direction, makes clear that the principle of geographic area of interest for the GEF is the High North, the North Atlantic and the Baltic Sea region. And necessarily varied threats of geographically dispersed allies in NATO, for example, are likely to detract from its regional focus, or at least we could say dilute its emphasis. It was noted to me by a close colleague that the sort of communique that came out from the Brussels NATO summit of 2021 in addressing what they were addressing that I'm referring to was necessarily in collaborated, coordinated activities. In addressing this, it did not mention the Arctic and only once referred to the High North. Clearly, and I hope this would be unlikely to be the case now, but a look at northern policy in NATO has often had, this kind of look north policy, I would say, has had competition from other compass points over the year, not least look south. Last December, when the UK Foreign Secretary, now Prime Minister, we tend to flip-flop these roles, it seems, made clear in a speech of the UK commitment, said that a network of security partnerships to protect our people, our partners and our freedoms, including the high seas and the high north. The GEF, the UK-led GEF is really a significant part of this. So just bringing this more into the subject again, I would say that whilst the relative freedoms of the GEF and NORDEFCO constructs have much to recommend them, it would be a mistake to view either the GEF or NORDEFCO as a rogue military actor. Of course, they have to work, they rely entirely on political consent, etc. But it's also worth a critical look at these freedoms. If some commentators describes that GEF is filling the gap between national forces and NATO, what does this actually mean? Does this mean that NATO is off the hook, if you like, for some things that might otherwise have been considered firmly within their lane? Will Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO change the way that the GEF and NORDEFCO are viewed, and thus how they operate? Will the responsiveness remain whilst NATO is thinking? And I think this is something we really need to imagine and work through and not allow just to fall into. What is clear is that Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO will double the length of Russia's border with NATO states and constrain the Russian Navy to the Baltic Sea as it becomes dominated by NATO allies. It represents, of course, as we've heard, the exact opposite of Moscow's original intent to halt the alliance's expansion. It will demand a policy of really wise reserve and vigilance on the part of NATO states. Indeed, NATO's desire to avoid escalation is clear, but that alone will not save the Arctic. Geographically, the Arctic cannot be avoided being part of an increased commitment to a containment strategy aimed at Russia, and through its economic reliance and influence and desire for influence, similarly to China. Containment comes at a very real cost. Whilst hybrid activity is hugely relevant, it does not, as some commentators suggest, deliver some kind of cheap form of deterrence without commitment. But persistence is vital. And I believe that one cannot get away from the need for an increase in hard military presence. I think it's widely understood that relying on the USA for the day in, day out of this is not the solution. The discussion around burden sharing has not been shelved. It's been moved across to another table for now, I would suggest. The JEF and NORDEFCO are two robust and tried and tested options. And yes, they have different roles, so let's be really clear about that. There's no doubting the expertise that member nations bring, the growing capability, a large investments in interoperability, hardware, notably F-35, P-8, the rebirth of carrier strike, the enlargement of other areas of the fleets, integration of new technology, increasing interoperability, procurement choices, etc. I can go on, but also importantly, harnessing decades, and really decades of tactical knowledge of how to operate in what is one of the world's most harshest environments. Refining TTPs, tactic techniques and procedures, is really important to support this. It's not new, and it's required, however, for the UK, for one, to relearn some lessons of the past. You know, we've spent a lot of time in warmer climates more recently. And really, and importantly, integrating new technology, and this is key. I personally cut my proverbial military teeth in a snow hole outside Porsangamon Garrison many, many years ago. But Arctic training is now firmly back on the curriculum in the UK across all three armed services. One final point then before we turn to discussion. I commented recently in a discussion with the Finnish ambassador to the US and others that we all join our own NATO. Each country wants something different from NATO, albeit subtly so. And NATO wants something different from each country, such as insight, geographical location, or operational capability. We need to start asking whether the JEF and NORDEFCO can overcome the ambiguity, and their focus on the high north might be something that NATO comes to rely on. And perhaps, ironically, this might offer a lifeline to the fragile Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you. You spoke about the very north and the high north and the potential of collaboration, the joint exercises. For instance, with the Air Force, earlier this week I was visiting the Air Force base in Rovaniemi, obviously with the discussion about the F-35, where the decision has been made also by Finland. Before the exercises were maybe F-16, F-18, maybe Saab, over there, but in the future it's more and more only F-35, as actually most of the European countries and NATO countries are for F-35. So what's your take on that?
I think it's a huge relief, actually. I think it's ultimately very powerful for interoperability. It's not just powerful for interoperability, it's powerful for spares supply, for supply chain, for sharing and exchange of personnel, which I think is critical because although we might have the same kit, we still operate differently, for understanding tactics, techniques and procedures. Yes, there's sometimes a weakness of all nations having the same kit. Let's be realistic about that. You know, probably no one's happier than America, of course, that everybody's having this kit. But I think from the UK government's perspective, it's a relief. And certainly, you know, Rand's an American company, so I feel I can speak on this side from the DoD. It's also a relief, not just from a financial point of view, economic point of view, but from a working together aspect. Yeah, for us, there's no bad side to it, I would say.
No risks?
The supply chain risks. I think that's always the way.
What about putting all eggs in the same basket?
Yeah, I would describe that as supply chain risk.
Okay.
I think the supply chain, though, is robust within this area, and there's a lot of work being done within the DoD to ensure that, you know, and some aspects taken out of industry's hands to ensure that. So I, for one, wouldn't class that as a high risk, maybe a low to medium risk.
Right, yeah. Thank you. Before opening up the floor to the audience, one follow-up question to Petteri, and then we'll open the floor. So, Petteri, weather information is crucial also in warfare, and it's becoming more and more crucial because of the climate change, and the weather patterns are going like more and more sparse. So, how do the meteorological services respond to this need, and are you faced with new challenges from the military users in this situation?
So most of the national meteorological and hydrological services, they are providing services both for civilian and military purposes, and that's of course where the cost benefit is highest. Some countries have separate services, but this kind of one source service makes sense, and that's also the case in this country.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Good. So let's open the floor for a discussion, and we start from there. Can we have the microphone, please, to the middle table in here?
Thank you very much, Tero. And I'd like to thank this panel, which I thought this was a fascinating discussion. My name is Petteri. I'm Finland's Arctic ambassador, senior Arctic official. I'm not only saying that the discussion was fascinating because you were talking about the Arctic, which is close to my heart, but it was also fascinating and very useful because you touched upon the various different aspects of Arctic cooperation. During the past 7 months, there's been a tendency to focus on the changes in the security policy environment, and these are important. But what I have time and time again underlined, that as we do that, we must not allow to lose sight of the climate change, environment, need for sustainable development, sustainable investments, and the people in the Arctic, including and in particular the indigenous peoples. These are important, they are core, and they are priority, and they must not be overshadowed by other considerations. Secondly, if I may, since Arctic Council, where I represent my country, was referred to on several occasions by the panelists, and they were right, they were good observations. But I have been trying to argue that the Arctic Council is important for 3 reasons. One, for the things that it does. It contributes directly to the IPCC reporting. It does valuable work in emergency preparedness, environment, climate, sustainable development, etc. Secondly, it is important because it's internationally unique with regard to the positions that the organizations of the indigenous peoples have in our structures at the level of working groups, senior Arctic officials, and at the ministerial level. They sit at the table with us, and they have a right to do that, and that's unique. And thirdly and lastly, the Arctic Council plays a key role in the Arctic governance, because that is the place that brings together the 8 Arctic states. There are not 7 Arctic states, and there are certainly not 9 Arctic states. There are 8 Arctic states. And Russia is a member of the Arctic Council. It is still in the Arctic Council. The 7 other Arctic Council members announced in March that in this situation we will not participate in the activities. But as Marisol rightly pointed out, we resumed those activities that where Russia was not involved in, and which had already been approved by the Arctic Council member states, all 8. And we do not use the notion of A7. The others do. We do not, because the Arctic Council has 8 members, not 7. And we look forward to the orderly transfer of the chairmanship to Norway next spring. So the Arctic Council is alive. It is functioning, and we're doing our best in a very difficult circumstances. And so that this is not only a comment, I also end up with a question, and I thank Marisol for having phrased the thawing of the permafrost, because when I was listening to Petteri list down the challenges and problems, he did not refer in particular to the permafrost, which is a huge problem also in terms of security. and we're looking at collapsing infrastructure in Russia and various parts of North America, it's a public health risk because of the pathogens that will be released in the atmosphere. So the question is, I just wonder if WMO has any particular view on the risk posed by the thawing permafrost. Thank you for the great panel.
Thank you very much, Petteri. So, Ruth, Arctic 7 or Arctic 8 or perhaps Arctic 9, including the United Kingdom and perhaps the whole Commonwealth. And what about the thawing permafrost?
So I'm going to stick to the area that I know, which is military. Okay, and the comment I would make on your I appreciate your comments and and your insight to it. I think if we can try and look forward a little bit to, I meant what I said when I think, the day when Russia's back in operating with the other 7 and you are back as that is very important. What I would be nervous of with a defense head on is that they're not a proxy for China when they're doing this because they're so weakened. China has an influence in there and has a huge interest. It's a near Arctic, whatever it calls itself. But I think that's a risk. I think that's a risk that we need to be aware of. A weakened Russia becomes more of a proxy for China. On the subject of permafrost, I am going to leave this to people who know a lot more about the risks of thawing permafrost.
Petteri, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that was a good addition. So I didn't mention it, but you luckily did it, and I think that's also one of the challenges that we will see infrastructures collapsing because of that. Even cities and gas pipelines they're nowadays exploding as well, but because of permafrost, they also danger roads, railroads, and so forth. So that's one of the challenges, and it's also very important to monitor what's going to happen to methane and carbon dioxide emissions from those areas. And fortunately, Russia, where they have the biggest part of Arctic when it comes to this potential of methane and carbon dioxide emissions, they have stopped delivery of the data from the stations, which are, by the way, paid by USA and Finland. So hopefully we could go back to normal one day on that. And then personally, I see that this kind of polarization that is now taking place between democratic and less democratic countries, that may also happen in the Arctic. So China is very much interested in becoming an important player there, and since the Western countries and companies have withdrawn from this oil and gas business from the Arctic, it may be that China will be an active one there in the future. So that's something just to keep in mind.
Very good. And by the way, considering thawing permafrost and landslides, Earth observation data can also be used in assessing the risk for that. So there are interferometric applications for that. Marisol, what are your thoughts on this one? You already touched upon it, but reflect, please.
Yeah, I mean, you could have a whole event just on permafrost because the implications of it thawing are like just incredibly profound. And it's largely because of how much of Alaska is underlaid by permafrost. All of our military bases have some level of discontinuous permafrost underlaying them. Russia, about 60% of Russia is underlaid by permafrost. And also in Greenland and in Canada, about 40% of Canada is underlaid. So yeah, we have, there's the pathogens that are emerging. In, I think, 2018, there was like an anthrax outbreak in the Russian Siberian Arctic. And there were actually a bunch of reindeer that ended up dying and some kids. And so it's not just about the pathogens that are coming out, it's also about then the research that's being done on what's coming out of the permafrost. How are these samples managed? What are they doing with them in the lab? There's a whole, biosecurity situation that also could have its own conversation. But then also just seeing things like increased amounts of radon that are being released from permafrost, and that that's a very potent cause of lung cancer. But it's it's odorless, you can't detect it, but it's in high enough levels in certain parts of the Arctic that there is actually concern about potential for causing lung cancer in these populations. So there's really just this, just from the changes alone, there's a whole array of challenges. But then there's also, in the Russian Arctic in particular, because they're so economically constrained right now, but Russia has really doubled down on their Arctic ambitions post-war. They have such a strong Arctic identity, just really saying that we're not budging at all in terms of what we're seeking to develop economically. They see their ability to realize the economic potential of their Arctic, including development of the Northern Sea Route and all of the different minerals and fossil fuel resources, as a matter of national security. And at the same time, because they're trying to unleash industry in economically constrained environment because of sanctions, they're doing things with parallel imports, right? There's issues with who is providing services for some of these stations, and then just this endemic corruption, right, that already was prevalent in Russia. We also know the state is deeply connected to transnational organized crime. So, there's all these different pieces that basically just increase risk. And if you look at just the example of the Norilsk diesel spill, which was the worst spill in the Arctic's history just 2 years ago, the media often talked about it as, permafrost thaw caused these diesel containers to spill and it got into the environment. But that's really not the complete story, because you have a facility that was this Nornickel facility that was egregiously non-compliant with regulations, the little regulations they have. And they actually had the sensors that would help them to understand when permafrost was thawing, if the tanks were starting to destabilize, and they just never installed them. So you have that, and then you have thawing permafrost. And thawing permafrost is like, the straw that broke the camel's back. And and then it was the worst spill. So something like that is only going to become worse as there's even less oversight and regulation about how industry is developing certain, certain products. And then our ability, if there is a transboundary pollution potential, our ability to detect that in a timely way is more important.
Thank you. Back to the floor. I think I saw Johanna's hand over there. Please, can we have the microphone again to the center table, and over to Johanna, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is the Arctic-minded table, I guess. My name is Johanna Ikävalko, and I'm the director of the Arctic Center, University of Lapland. And thank you for the panelists for these introductions. Before I actually ask my question, I would just like to tell a bit about the Arctic Center. We study the Arctic in general, people, livelihoods, ecosystems, environment, sustainability, governance. We don't study climate change in the Arctic as a physical phenomenon, but like the effects of climate change. That is what we do. But now we are in a kind of an identity crisis. We have this long history, a kind of a crown jewel of having done research with Russian organizations and individuals, but we can't do that anymore. As of early March, no European research funding is actually flowing to Russia, neither to Belarus, and it is not in the horizon that the situation would change. So we are now sort of going through a kind of a self-analysis of what should we do, what should we study in the Arctic, what is relevant, especially in the future, as we can assume that we will lack a lot of data and information from a big chunk of the Arctic, almost more than 50%, geographically 50% of the Arctic. So this means that we have huge gaps in information and data that we used to have, and also connections to organizations and individuals. So I'm asking from this panel that what do you see that what needs to be studied in the Arctic in the near future and in the a little bit further future? And especially I'm interested in the emerging topics for research. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. So let's go with the scientific community and start with you, Petteri, please.
Yes, as I said, this basic meteorological data is still exchanged, and of course we have satellite information available from that region, and we have also models. So some major means still exist, and we can still carry out the research, but this kind of physical interaction with the scientists on their side seems to be ceased, at least for the coming years, which is a loss, and it's especially a loss for them because their skills have been a bit limited already before the war.
Thank you, Marisol, please.
Yeah, so I alluded to it briefly earlier, which was basically this idea that, you know, perhaps through increased use of satellites and different types of sensors that we would be able to try to gather some data around things like methane. So there's I believe it's a French and German satellite, Merlin, that'll be coming online. That'll be really useful with a methane monitoring mission. But I mean, there's so many areas where we need to be studying things because of just we've never been alive during a time where we've had these levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and so basically, I mean, we have to question so many things. There's so many basic assumptions that we are making that need to be questioned because, you know, just even this idea about, like, I think some of the most important work is how do we do the culture shifts necessary for humans to like change their attitudes so that we can actually get this right, you know, and because a lot of it is just these conceptual frameworks, and some of them are, you know, more deeper and kind of psychological, but some of them are things just like we think about coastlines as being static, right? And if you look in geologic time, that's just not the case. And so we really need to be changing the way that we design coastlines, that they're going to be having much more flux, and that's going to be the norm. And so how do we, you know, we need to rapidly be getting people to understand this and design architecture that can handle the flux, right? So it's really kind of like more things like that, and like how do we shift as a society, and then, you know, also how can we just have solutions to climate change that also help to address things like socioeconomic inequality, racial inequality. You know, I'm a big fan of multifunctional policy because we have so much to get done that we need like maximum bang for our buck. For every like topic, there's so many different subject areas for research. So it's also something I'd be happy to chat more about.
Ruth?
Yeah, one of the areas we do quite a lot of study on is food security, and I think that's probably one of the most concerning. And if you add to it the war in Ukraine right now, people are very slow, I think, to come to the realization that had an impact on food security. You know, who knew that Ukraine grew wheat? Where were we all? You know, and these food not coming out of areas like that obviously impacts really vulnerable areas, you know, areas like Bangladesh, who are already suffering hugely under climate change conditions, parts of Africa, parts of the Yemen, etc. Really vulnerable areas are getting food from Ukraine. You put on top of that a bunch of climate change issues, and you really have a disaster. And it's not just, you know, a disaster in a sort of humanitarian level, but it's, you know, becomes something that's very easy to be exploited by malign actors. You've seen the activity of ISIS and other groups who come into areas that are suffering. suffering from, you end up with a famine, you can't get grain in, price of grain goes up, they can't afford it, people starve, people turn to easily influenced by other people. So these things don't just stop with we're not investigating stuff in the Arctic. The cascade of events that comes from not understanding the impact of climate change. So when you hit I'm going to call it a road bump, and this is not, it's a bad phrase, but it's late. Like a war, then you're already in a bad space, and you hit this road bump. You're in a really bad space before you know it. And we're not quick enough to respond to these kind of crises around the world. With even if we had 6 Jeffs. So understanding these problems and getting on top of them make us far more resilient as a society. I think one thing we didn't talk about in the Arctic, and I don't know enough to comment hugely on it, but I would say is the legacy left from the Cold War and Russia's activity in there with regard to nuclear, and with them, us not engaging with them there, the sort of the legacy and the waste issue there, I think is probably a concern. And I think that's something we probably need to be calling out on a little more.
Thank you very much. Could we then have the microphone to the front table for Mr. Iloniemi, please, and then we'll go for Mr. Villain.
My question is related to the discussion we just had. As a layman, one would think that the rise of sea level is something where it is possible to have some sort of an agenda concerning also the time, how fast it will be and what the consequences then are. We know from past experience that people tend to build in flood areas, they build on volcano slopes, they build in earthquake-sensitive areas, and therefore the question really is it politically possible at all to have such policies where in lowland places one would really regulate in an efficient way?
Thank you. Petteri, please.
Yeah, so this is one of the risks where we have had lots of uncertainty, but I was just at the Glaciology conference in Iceland a few weeks ago, where they were showing that there's a major risk that the Antarctic glacier, where we have potential of 60 meters sea level rise if we would melt the whole glacier. So it seems that it may be melting in a more speedy manner than we thought before, because there's intrusion of warm water from under the glacier, and that seems to be speeding up the melting. And the scientists from NASA, they estimated that there's a risk to see sea level rise of the order of 5 to 15 meters by 2300, which is, of course, we won't be alive by then, but still many big cities and the global population, they are very much living on coastal areas, and that's the case in Asia. If you look at China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, also big African cities. We have also major European cities, even London is threatened, and Scandinavia, Copenhagen, New York, Los Angeles, several big cities worldwide are going to be affected, and the fact that we have been warming the ocean, we have started seeing growing amount of category 4 and 5 tropical storms, hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones, and these storm surges may lead to sea level rise for short term by several meters. So this is also one risk besides this average sea level rise. But it seems that there's a bigger risk than we thought before. So that's one of the things, and that's something that should stimulate governments in China and India to enhance their ambition level. And unfortunately, we already have such a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that this melting of glaciers and sea level rise is supposed to continue for the coming hundreds of years anyhow. So we have partly lost that game already.
Thank you. Can you please again repeat the number which you mentioned considering the Antarctic melt? Was it 60?
So in that conference, the NASA scientists, they have published that in the science paper Nature, which is the leading paper. The estimation was that it's ranging from 5 to 15 meters by 2003.
5 to 15 meters.
Yes, globally. So that's a high number, and those are new results, and that's very much because of this intrusion of water from down to the glacier. So that's a little bit alarming news, I would say.
Luckily, my house is on a hill.
I have my house here in Finland at 50 meters altitude.
Okay. But you have the most recent scientific data available, so you have the advantage. Mr. Willem, please, in the middle table again.
Sorry on behalf of us dominating the discussion here. Actually, Ruth, you were the one who provoked me to ask for the floor because your last comments, what you get forward there, concerning the nuclear waste and issues in Arctic. Because I think all you've had demonstrated that the enormous impacts on climate and the climate change consequences what we have. And you also have telling about catch-22, that we need to freeze Russia out, but there's also issues that we really need to talk with them. And I would like to ask all of you that would you then see, or could you define what would be the specific areas where this might actually happen when we think about unthinkable? And I give you one hint, and maybe it's just a piece of information, participants. Just before the war started in Ukraine, European Union and Russia were able to have principal agreement on the fact concerning the submarines K159 and K27. In the bottom of the Baltic Sea, you have two submarines which are scientifically proven to be the most dangerous objects in the bottom of the oceans. There's 17,000 radiating objects as the legacy of the Soviet Union, but these two submarines are the most dangerous ones because even by Russian acceptance, we are not talking about any more hundreds of years or 2,100 or whatever. In 20 years' time, these two submarines will start to leak in 20 years' time. And there's K159 is outside of Murmansk in 280 meters. And it will radiate 800, it has 800 kilos of waste inside. According to scientists, it will increase 1,000 times the radiation level or poison level of the COTS. And just to give you a hint, the value of these fishing stocks is for Russia and Norway are 1.4 billion euros per year. So would you say that we might have an element where the common interest actually can find for this kind of cooperation in the issues, even whatever happens in the case? And another question also for Ruth, would you elaborate a bit more about the role of China? Because the Chinese role is something which is always behind us, as you said, the near Arctic state and nation. China tried to buy a few years ago 5% of the land mass of Iceland. If you know that 5 years ago, or roughly 10 years ago, they asked for 5% of the land mass of Iceland in that. So tell us about, and the perspective for them is not 4 years like usually maximum in our countries. It can be 50, 100, 150 years. And there's a rumors somewhere in the back that China is looking for the position, they are demanding the role for themselves, and if they don't get it, we are not talking anymore about Russia as their proxy, but even building completely new kind of structures. So the question is, do you see that Arctic Council actually has sustainability, or do we have a situation that all of this leads also completely new kind of structures?
Thank you very much. Excellent question. So the fact is also considering China that Russia just declared a new development strategy of the Northern Sea Route, which is purely focusing on East, specifically saying that this is nothing for the Americas, this is nothing for Europe, this is only for Asia and specifically China with a number of investments. And so Ruth, could you start exploring this? Sure. And also taking into account the questions on China, and then we'll go for concluding remarks, but I'll then before that get a few comments from the other panelists also on China before closing. Ruth, please.
So just, I'm conscious of the time, so just briefly, and we can talk more after. On the Northern Sea Route, as I alluded to, this isn't something that you flick a switch and it comes on. The infrastructure required to build that is something on a scale that's hard to imagine. And Russia and China aren't good at that in a sustainable way, particularly Russia. So I think there's a lot of rhetoric around that. I think realizing it is it would be exceedingly challenging. I think it's something that China and, well, certainly Russia has to talk up to make it, look like we're looking to China. It's two fingers up to America. But realizing that is really, it's. I wish I had an order of magnitude to explain how hard that will be to make that robust enough to be useful. On China. Yeah, so we're doing a large piece of work at the moment on the sort of assessment of the will to fight of the Taiwanese people, for example. China looking this way? Is China looking that way? Is China looking too many ways? I think I mentioned that because everyone's very nervous about China and what they're going to do. We're sitting on the edge to see. I think the worst thing you can do is not talk to China. About these issues. And I think that we've made that mistake in the past. Talking to China doesn't mean we're agreeing with China or we're trying to cozy up to them or whatever. But the Chinese like to be listened to and like to be involved in the conversation. And I think it's really important that we understand Chinese culture enough to appreciate why China is doing what it's doing, because it really is actually very important in the relationship. It's also very important to remember that China does have influence over Russia, and actually using that influence in a positive way could be a game changer. Not just, and I'm not talking about Putin, but I'm talking more for everything that surrounds Putin. We don't know the conversations that go on between China and Russia, and I think it would be bad to second guess. I think we should also remember that China is a very fragile country too, on a lot of levels, economically, its own personal and security challenges. And sometimes it likes to make a noise over here to stop you looking over there. And I think there could be a great deal of more. I could talk a lot about this, but I'm aware that we've got a red flashing light. So.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Could we have then final remarks from Marisol and then Petteri, including China, and your concluding comments, please?
Sure. Okay. So just to address the very salient point about the submarines, that's something that's like exactly a case study that I've been watching, and was very dismayed, to see that the planned meeting for this summer that was supposed to convene international experts to advise Russia on this highly technical retrieval process of these two subs that we know are already starting to degrade, and they're deeper than anything we've recovered before. So, it's imperative that we get this right. I think it's hard to say, with things still escalating, it's really hard to say that, okay, well, we'd be re-engaging soon. But I would imagine that, if, I don't know, when things eventually kind of start to peter out, I could see that as being one of the places we would first engage, because again, the transboundary risk potential is just enormous. And then I guess I just also wanted to quickly comment when you're talking about how people like to build in floodplains and all of that. This is also where we're going to be seeing the insurance and reinsurance companies really throwing cold water on people's ideas about rebuilding, and in terms of even the insurance premiums that people are going to be seeing, or what's going to be covered or what's not. And we even saw that just last week when the hurricane that went up to Prince Edward Island in Canada, and really, it was a really destructive storm, and the insurance companies were like, we're not covering certain things, like it's just not happening. And that was shocking to people because they didn't even know they had exposure to certain types of risks or hazards. They never thought to get insurance for it, but thought it might be included. And they're like, oh no, we're not going to cover that. So that's the thing too, is it's not like, communities that they know that they have this risk. We're seeing changes where new types of hazards are expanding geographically, and people don't understand what those are. And so that's going to be a very rude wake-up call, and will have a big impact on property values. And then just in terms of the Russia-China relationship, yeah, I would just say that it's a very complex relationship. Russia has, like I said before, a very strong Arctic identity, has really, been interested in China's financing, but is not interested in, bringing China too much into the Arctic. They've been very cautious about the ways they've engaged. However, Putin has basically, sent Russia back to the Stone Ages, so they are going to be looking for new opportunities. They certainly will be, pressured to potentially grant concessions that they would not previously have been comfortable with, and that could relate to things like, military activity in the Arctic. And we even just saw a joint naval maneuver with Russian and Chinese military vessels in Alaska's EEZ just last week, and it's a legal maneuver, but it's something that's just demonstrating this show of force, and again is kind of building this strategic ambiguity about the extent to which their relationship may evolve, because they try to present this very rosy picture, but it's obviously much more complex than that.
Thank you, Petteri.
Yeah. There's growing interest in many Asian countries to become player in the Arctic. We have seen Iceland has organized these Arctic Circle meetings, and we have seen that it's not only China, it's also Japan, South Korea, Singapore, which have shown great interest to become some sort of player. Even India has established a station to Spitsbergen just to be present in the region. So there's wider interest towards the Arctic and the shipping routes and also these resources that we have there. But if we look at this issue, this war in Ukraine from global perspective, the key issue is going to be the impact on economies of less developed countries, food security crisis, which is clearly cooking at the moment. We will have major challenges with fertilizers and also food supply from Ukraine and Russia, which may have an impact in the Arabic world, but also much wider. So that's one of the things, and that's why some of the countries in New York didn't vote for this Ukraine clause last spring. So it's something to keep in mind. And one should keep in mind that climate change is still number one challenge for the welfare of mankind this century, and it's important that this crisis in Ukraine doesn't shadow that, because that's going to be crisis that will last for even centuries if we fail with the mitigation. And there has been good progress in Glasgow last year, and we are just heading towards Sharm el-Sheikh climate conference, and there we will pay much more attention to adaptation, and also in the Arctic area we have to adapt to climate change, because this area will face the largest change globally.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much, dear panelists, for an excellent discussion, for your great and innovative remarks. Thank you very much, dear audience, of staying vigilant and coming with active questions. And before some practical advice will follow in a minute or two, please join me in applauding our great panel today.